Thanks everyone for voting very promptly and using the boxes properly, which is excellent. So now we come to the main event, although voting is of course always the main event of today's meeting, which is our evening lecture, which will be called, the title of which is Biodiversity, well you can see here, Biodiversity's Winners and Losers from Climate Warming. Our speaker is Jane Hill, who's a professor of ecology in the Department of Biology at the University of York. Jane is a trustee of the Southeast Asia Rainforest Research Partnership, and she's also a trustee of the British Ecological Society. She received the Marsh Zoological Society of London Award for Conservation Biology in 2011, and she's an honorary fellow of the Royal Entomological Society. Jane is also heavily involved in promoting diversity, particularly the advancement of women in science, and she has led the York Biology Department to getting an Athena Swan Gold Award, which are actually far and few between. They really are very hard to get. So that has been a lot of work for her, in addition to the day job. So today, Jane will examine recent patterns of climate-driven range changes amongst butterfly species, and how this knowledge is being used to inform conservation on the ground. Over to you, Jane.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to come and talk to you today about the research that we're doing in my lab at York. So I guess coming down on the train, I was sort of thinking about how timely it is, of course, to be talking about impacts of climate change. I mean, there's the awful fires in Australia at the moment, increase in extreme events, a lot of flooding. Flooding is quite common in York, but the frequency and the extremity of it is increasing. So extreme events, also looking on the BBC webpage, it's just been announced that 2019 was the hottest year with the exclusion of 2016, which was an ENSO year. And so there's lots of records being broken, you know, summer temperatures this year, breaking records, and so on. So it's very timely to be thinking about climate change impacts. And then that's all wrapped up with thinking about the Extinction Rebellion, about thinking about how people are concerned about biodiversity losses, and the IPBES statement about 1 million species threatened with extinction, thinking about Greta Thunberg and the climate strikes and so on. So there's a lot of activity at the moment in thinking about what it is that could be done. So I'm going to spend most of my talk just explaining to you what the current state of knowledge is, and the things that we now know about climate change impacts, and then I will leave you with some solutions. I think ecologists, biologists, often we get told that we just bring the bad news and we don't give any hope about how we could solve these things. So I will, at the end, talk a little bit about what possible solutions there could be. And the other thing before I get started, I'd just like to say that I started doing climate change just after my PhD, which seems a terribly long time ago, and was actually last century. And so I've been studying climate change for a very long time, and seeing all of these things that are happening now are what was predicted. And also seeing the evidence of climate change in front of your own eyes has been quite an interesting process for me to go through. So what I'm going to do this evening is just go through some of the overall results that we've been collecting over the last 20 years or so, and try and pull it together in a sort of overarching framework. I'll be presenting quite a lot of the data and graphs and so on, but hopefully you'll also be able to pick out the general patterns that we're seeing, and how it's leading us to come to the conclusions that we have. So I want to start off with thanking the people that I've had the pleasure to work with and to collaborate with. As you'll realise, if you're working in this field, most of the research is done by your collaborators, by your students, by the researchers in your lab, and not by me, not for quite a long time actually. And so it's really important for me to thank all of those people and the sort of data that I'll be presenting, and also thank all of the people who've been funding the work as time's been going on. So I'm sure you'll all be very familiar with these sorts of graphs about the degree to which temperature records are being broken. So as I say, the hottest year on record is still 2016, and the reason that that was the hottest year on record was it was also an El Nino event, so an ENSO event. So when we get, these are when you get particularly hot conditions. But 2019 has now come in as the second hottest year on record, just behind 2016. Sorry, this data point isn't on there, but that pink blob is about where I think the 2019 data would be. So now over 1 degree above the average, above the baseline in terms of where we estimate our values from. And then also we know now that the last decade also was the hottest on record. So lots of records being broken, and I suppose thinking about how does this affect biodiversity. So I'm going to be talking mostly about Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moths, and there's a good reason why that is. And there's also a good reason why a lot of the information about climate change and about the ecological impacts of climate change comes from the UK. And that goes back, probably reflecting a lot of the people in the photographs, in the pictures around here, is the interest that British people have in recording biodiversity. So if you look at all of the records that there are, going back to sort of Victorian times, Victorians love to record insects, they love to record particularly Lepidoptera. And so if you look globally, the Lepidoptera are one of the best groups in which to understand long-term changes over time. So there's a certain types of taxa that we work on a lot. So we work on butterflies and moths, we also work on birds, and occasionally also on plants. And out of all of the taxonomic groups, I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, those are the ones that are really, really well studied. So we have lots of information going back over decades. So this is my favourite butterfly. This is the speckled wood. So this is one of the ones I first started working on last century, and this was one of the first species that we started to get information for to see that it was changing its range and it was responding to climate change. And we still are working on this species today. Can I just ask if any of you in the room contribute to the recording schemes, such as, say, Butterfly Monitoring Scheme or handing in your records? Fantastic. I'd just like to say thank you, because those are the data that we use in our analyses. So we work with Butterfly Conservation, we work with Rothamsted, we work with CEH in terms of analysing all of these data. And it's because there are these fantastic data that we know so much about how biodiversity has changed. And just going back briefly to the Lepidoptera for a moment, there's another really good reason why this is a great group to work on, because we have different types of data that come in. So we have the transect data that have been running since the 70s, where people walk a fixed route, and they walk that every couple of weeks and at those sites, and that's been going on, as I say, since the 70s. So you get information about population trends and about abundance patterns. And then the other piece of the other data that we have are also the records that people send in from things that they see when they're out and about. And so we talk about those in terms of distribution data or occurrence data. And so you'll see when I go through my talk, I'll mention both the transect data as well as the distribution data. And we generally analyse both of those sets of data. And they tell us slightly different things. And they have very different biases and they have their different benefits and pros and cons. But they are such a great data set going back so many decades that it's an absolutely fantastic resource. The other thing I would say is that the UK, compared with other countries globally, is relatively small, and there's a lot of people, and there are relatively few butterflies and moths. So they're all very well studied. I mean, we're talking about 60 butterflies, most of which can be identified on the wing. You don't have to catch them to identify them. So I think a lot of people find that a manageable number of species to work with, and so the data are pretty robust. People don't tend to make mistakes. So a combination of a small country, a lot of people, and not that high biodiversity means what we do have is very well recorded. And then the other thing is that a lot of species reach their northern range margins in Britain. So out of the 60 or so butterflies, nearly all of them reach the northern margin often somewhere around York, actually. And that's where it starts to get a bit too cold for a lot of these warm-loving butterflies. So if you want to be able to understand how the climate is affecting species, then you want to go out to the range margins and see how those range margins are shifting. And you can do that for a lot of species in Britain. And we also have a few butterflies and moths that are more northern and montane, and so they reach their sort of southern warm edge to their distribution in Britain as well. So for a small number, not as many, but for a small number of species, we can also look at what's going on in those locations where they're becoming limited because it's getting too hot. And so if you want to understand what species are doing in relation to climate change, you really want to be doing quite a lot at the range margins. So that's what makes the UK another good reason to be studying our biodiversity. So that's why we've been so lucky. So coming back to the speckled wood, this is, as I say, this is a great species, and there'll be quite a few pieces of data that I'll mention around the speckled wood butterfly. As I say, when people first heard that I was starting work in York, and they sort of say, well, if you work on butterflies, why on earth do you want to be in York? It's sort of very depauperate. You'll say, well, actually, there's lots of really exciting things moving through, and lots of things colonising Yorkshire and heading north. So when I arrived in York in 2001, we first started to see speckled woods come through. So when I first started to do my research at York, I had to head south to get to the range margin. I now have to head a long way north if I want to get to the range margin, because it's way up past Newcastle now. So you know, in the last 20 years, I've seen how these species are shifting their ranges. But if you think about what species can do as the climate changes, well, there's sort of three options. So species can shift their range and keep track of climate. They could stay put and adapt in situ, and when we talk about adaptation, well, that could be genetic changes, or it could come about because of plastic responses. So the ability of populations and species to show different responses through the environmental changes. So sort of staying put and trying to cope, if you like. And then, of course, the final one is going extinct. And that could be the whole of your population going extinct. If you're a northern species or a montane species, you've just got nowhere to shift to, you've run out of space. Or it could be a species like the speckled wood, it has a European range, and as it's shifting north, of course, at its southern margin, which is down in North Africa, it will be shifting northwards and uphill. So there will be local extinctions in that area as well as a consequence of climate. So those extinctions could be throughout the species range, or it could be some local extinctions. So what I've spent most of my time focusing on is looking at how species are shifting their range. But I will say a little bit at the end about some current work that we're doing around these plastic and genetic changes. And of course, because we've been interested in shifts, we've also been looking at how species are going extinct. So I'm going to talk about these range shifting. And I just want to start off with what's rather an old slide now. So this is some of the first work that we started to do to pull together a wide range of data sets just to see what on earth was going on. So this was quite influential at the time, talking to policymakers and just showing this sort of synthesis of information. So this is way back now in 2006. And these are all from the from working with Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So these are all the different recorder schemes. These are occurrence records for which we just gathered them all together. You can see here's a huge range of different species, all animals. We just looked to see what's the degree to which species are shifting north at that time. Don't need to worry too much about the different colours. This is an issue about trying to cope with biases in the recorder data set, because over time, people have got more enthusiastic in recording species, so there's many more data coming in. So we have, it's a nice problem to have, if you like, but you have to try and work out how to subsample your species to make sure that your data isn't just showing range expansion northwards, if you like, because you're just getting more records coming in. So this was the first time that we were able to show very convincingly that just about everything is heading north. So what's on the y-axis here is how much the range margin of all of these different species within all of these different taxonomic groups have shifted northwards. So the first one, without looking into any detail, first of all, is just most things have shifted northwards during the time. And we spent most of the last 15 years or so trying to understand what the drivers are for those range shifts. And very few things have actually declined in terms of the distribution extent, and they're shifting southward. So that's the one thing I'd like you to take from this. The other thing that we realised quite quickly, that there is an enormous amount of variation among species. These are just the average amount, so there's a huge amount of variation. So we're interested in understanding what drives that. And then finally, there's this lag. So if you over the time period that we're studying, we work out that isotherms shifted northwards by about 120 kilometres. So if species were keeping perfect track of climate, that's as fast as they should have moved. And you can see here, that's that line there at about 120 kilometre shift. Most things are lagging behind climate. So that's the other bit of important information we got from this. Most species are heading northwards, but there's a lot of lags, and then starting to think about why things aren't keeping perfect track of climate. And you won't be able to see the detail on this, but this is just an update that we did in this, obviously this fantastic journal in 2015 by Susie Mason. So she took the same data and she just updated it because of all your efforts at recording things, there's always more information coming through. And all I would say is hope if you can just sort of squint at this, you can sort of see that all of the bars are still heading upwards. So things are still continuing to shift northwards. And the sorts of things that we could now do with the data, because they were over such long time periods, we could start to split them up into different time intervals and start to compare what was happening over different intervals. So as you can see here, we've started to divide the data into an earlier time period, which is the 60s and 70s, a sort of mid-time period of the 80s and 90s, and then comparing that with the third time period in the 2000s. And then rather than just comparing a past and a present, you can start to compare time slices as you move through and just look to see what the patterns are doing. And regardless of whether it's the same taxa or different time periods, things are continuing to head northwards. But the other thing I would say is that there's, you probably can't see, but there's a lot of error bars on here which represent the variation among the species within that particular taxonomic group. And the colours again represent the ways in which we're trying to deal with bias in the data. So we're still seeing a lot of variation among species. So coming back to my title about winners and losers, these are some of the real winners. So these are some of the butterflies that we know are shifting their range and tracking climate. Some of these are real stars for me in Yorkshire. So this one moved through York and headed northwards about 20 years ago. Lots of range expansion in the marbled white, in the Yorkshire, in the Wolds. And the comma moved through Yorkshire in about the 80s and is now up into Scotland. The gatekeeper's also heading northwards into County Durham, and then this one is a southerly species, but this is also a sort of textbook example of range expansion and as a consequence of climate change. So if you take all of these butterflies and say how much are they shifting northwards, well, overall we reckon it's about 1.75 kilometres per year. So these are not migratory species. These are our resident butterflies, and they are moving forward. They're resident, and they're breeding, and they're moving forward. These are not the sort of painted lady migrants that are travelling thousands of kilometres. These are just our normal, I hate to say bog standard, they're obviously not bog standard, are they? But these are just our normal butterflies that are resident in the UK, and they are shifting northwards. So if you just work out what that is, that's 5 metres per day. So on average, so this must be about 5 metres along here. That's how fast they're moving on average. So it's quite a rate, but they're still lagging behind climate. So I thought I'd just show you I'm sure some of you have seen these records. So these are the observation records that people have sent in. This is the sort of data that we analyse. So this is the speckled wood heading north. Some of you may know that you don't have to go that far back, and it was all the way through the UK, and it showed some retractions in the 19th century and basically became restricted to Oban. So this is why we have this break in the population at the moment, but they're joining together, and I'm sure it won't be long before they catch up. But you have basically two expansion up here from the populations from Oban, but you also have your expansion here in northern England as well. But the speckled wood is doing pretty well. This is a winner, so it's going at about twice the average rate of range shift. But here's your absolute winner. Comma is has just been steaming northwards. It feeds on nettles and so on. Doesn't run out of food plant. Does really well. And as you can see here, it's going about an order of. Sorry. It's going here about an order of magnitude, again, faster than the average. So this is really quick. And those of you who know about commas know that you know whether it's breeding because you get the slightly different colour form, so you know when it's resident in the location. So those are the sorts of data that we analyse. These are the sorts of things that we do with these data. So as I already said, there's the distribution changes. So this is what we call our citizen science data. These are the things that many of you are contributing to. And we use those data to work out the distribution change. So that's just the sort of areal extent. So you just count up the number of grid squares where there's records to work out what your area is. And then you can work out where your range margin is from this, and then you work out how the range margin shifts. So this is a small skipper data set, and these here are showing where the range margin has moved over the different time periods, taking into account this issue with biases. And then what I've not shown here are these abundance trends from the Transect, so we use that information as well. But Generally, I'll be using one or other of these measures, either the distribution change, which is how it's changed in area, how the range margin has shifted northwards, and whether or not the abundance trends have changed. So this brings together a huge amount of information. And this is for butterflies and moths, and shows these are the Transect data and the light trap data, because we have the Rothamsted data from the 1960s onwards, and then these are the citizen science data for distribution size. So what I've shown on here is what the 0 point is. So anything to the right has either increased over time, or here has increased in distribution size over time, or has shifted its range northwards. And mostly what I would say is these different types of data sort of tell us the same thing, but those eagle-eyed amongst you will see that actually during this time of a lot of range shifting here, actually there's been a lot of declines. So it is possible for species to shift northwards and move their range margin northwards whilst their abundance trends are declining. So this was something that we've been studying to try and find out why actually overall most species have declined in abundance whilst they've increased in their distribution extent and they've shifted their range northwards. So I just want to take an aside to just, after saying there's some quite straightforward patterns here, I just want to introduce you to some of the complexities that we've been struggling with and the degree to which some of these complexities make it difficult to work out whether there are straightforward solutions to some of these issues towards helping species respond and adapt to climate change. So I'm going to just say a little bit about some of the things that have surprised us over time. I suppose going back to that very first histogram I showed you, which showed that species were shifting northwards, we sort of thought, oh, that's very straightforward. Let's move on to something new now. We've sort of shown that. And actually, when you look at some of these data in a bit more detail, we realise that was not the case. And I suppose they always say don't repeat your analyses, don't they? Because you never know what you might find that's new. So this was a student came in and they were just playing with the data. And we sort of said, oh, let's just see what's going on by comparing the different time periods. So what this student did was to say, let's have a look at how the change in the range margin or the change in the distribution or the change in the abundance in this first time period, let's just see whether they're correlated with what happened to the range margin, the distribution extent and the abundance trends in the second time period. So each of these dots on these graphs are a species where you plot what it did in one period against what it did in the other. And there are no relationships here. And this, we kept saying to the student, oh, you must have done a mistake, this can't be right. Go back and reanalyse it. And so they were very patient and kept on coming back and said, no, this is what we're finding. So what we're seeing is that there's a lot of variation, not only between species within a taxonomic group, but there seems to be quite a lot of variation within an individual species over time. So it actually means that perhaps species change from being winners to losers over time, or maybe in different parts of their range. So this sort of adds a little bit to the complexity. So we were sort of expecting here that we could draw a nice straight line through these and say, what's on your x-axis is related to what's on your y-axis, and that is not the case. And the other thing that the student did, so this is work done here by Louise Mayer, we wanted to look to see what the drivers were. And we found that actually there was a very good relationship with what was, just for one variable here, just looking at the change in the distribution extent, look to see what might be a driver. And we found that in the earlier time period, there was quite a clear relationship between habitat availability for the species and whether it had shifted its range. No relationship with these other two variables. So it didn't matter how good a disperser, how good a species was at flying, it didn't seem to have any effect. And then when you move on and look at the later time period, it seems that habitat availability is no longer important. And now what the correlation is the degree to whether or not a species is increasing in its population trends or not, whether its abundance is increasing. So what we conclude from this is that habitat availability was the limiter in the earlier time period, but because of the data that I just showed you before about the degree to which most species are actually declining in abundance, the abundance trends have now become limiting. So you've got a different limiter, if you like, to what drives your distribution change. So maybe some of this variation within a species is reflecting some environmental changes and how those have changed over time. And in a way, this is probably rather bad news because it implies that lots of things to do with the populations of species are just continuing to decline, even though their ranges are shifting, to the extent that that is now limiting whether or not they can expand. So everything that I've talked about now are all for species that reach a northern range margin in the UK, so the things like the speckled wood and the comma. Just like to say a few things about these lovely northern species that we have. So these are the species that you have to go up yomp up a mountain or go up to Scotland in order to see. Yomping up mountains was what Aldina Franco did. So she went back to the historical data and went back and resurveyed locations to see whether or not these species had gone extinct or not. So these are species that reach their southerly warm range margin in the UK. They're retracting northwards, if you like, and we were looking to see the degree to which there were extinctions at their range margins. So out of all of the species that we could think about in the UK, these northern and montane ones are most likely to be the losers, because these are cool adapted species in regions where it's just getting far too hot for them. So across these four species, she found that 3 of them had extinctions that were related to climate change. And across the sites that she was looking at, these extinctions, there were a lot of extinctions. So 24% here, of which about 3/4 were climate related. And here, about half of the sites she went to, there was extinction, and that was climate related as well. So not good news for these northern and montane species. And we had a project just finished recently where Andy Suggett went out and redid the survey. So Aldina did that in 2007, and we did it about 10 or 11 years later. And essentially what we wanted to check was that we didn't just have a snapshot where we were thinking things had gone extinct because we just didn't record them. So present throughout means that these are all of the sites where Aldina found that they were present in 2006, and Andy said, yes, they are still present. And these are ones where Aldina had said, yes, they're extinct, and Andy said, yes, they are extinct, or at least he didn't see them in his study. But we do have a bit of turnover here. So there are things where Aldina originally said she thought it had gone extinct, and we found that it had been recolonised, and then Andy's found some more extinctions in the last 10 years than Aldina found. So there's a bit of turnover, but the overall pattern is, as we would expect. For these species, it's getting too hot, it's getting too dry, and they are disappearing from these sites at the southerly limits of their range as they shift uphill or they retract their range northwards. So right at the start, I mentioned the fact that these range shifts were lagging behind the isotherms, that things haven't moved 120 kilometres northwards as they should if they are keeping track with the climate. So we know that one of the things that is an issue and driving these lags is the amount of habitat that's available. So if you're a butterfly trying to move across landscapes in the UK, this is the sort of thing that you have to move through. Imagine you're a woodland butterfly. You're in this sort of little fragment of woodland, and you're trying to shift and find new woodland. And then there's lots of inhospitable landscape, which could be intensive agriculture, urban areas, whatever. And so we know that species are having a difficulty shifting their ranges because these natural habitats that we live in have been fragmented. So we've done quite a lot of work thinking about what is the role, what is the problem with habitat fragmentation? And then, of course, you start thinking about how can we restore habitats to improve connectivity? And that's something I'll come to at the end to explain what sorts of solutions we might find. So coming back to some of the very early work that I did, and again, we're back to a fantastic speckled wood butterfly. So what we have on this graph here is patterns of range expansion in 2 locations in the UK. So this is the Scottish population as it's expanding its range. And here is everything in northern England, thinking about where it's expanding its range in Yorkshire. And what we have here on this map here is not a map of the butterfly, but this is a map of where its habitat is. So larger and more black means that there's more woodland habitat. Not surprisingly, speckled wood butterfly, the clue's in its name, likes woodland. So this is where woodland is in the UK. And I know there's lots of differences between Scotland and Yorkshire, but one of the big differences in these areas that we were looking at the range expansion is the amount of woodland within that region. The Vale of York is very fragmented from a perspective of woodland availability. So what we then found is that if you compare the range expansion rates for the amount of habitat, there's a huge reduction in the range expansion rate of the butterfly, about half of the rate in Yorkshire, even though there's only about 25% less woodland. So habitat loss seems to have a very strong impact on range expansion. It's not a sort of one-to-one relationship. And we know in some situations your amount of habitat can drop so much that there's just no range expansion at all, or it's just too difficult to get to some of these locations. So I just want to say something very briefly about some work that Phil Platts here has been doing. And again, he's taken all of the records for butterflies in the UK, sent in by citizen scientists, and used those as a way of trying to work out what the habitat type is that species like. And he's done this over hundreds of species, not just butterflies and moths, all of the species he could get information from. And the way you do that is you take the land cover data from the UK, which is from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and it is divided up into different land use types, moorland, grassland, bogs, wetland areas, woodland areas, and so on. And you take all your records and you just say, where do all the records occur that people have sent in? And you get different patterns. So this is a generalist species. The records come through in lots of different land use categories. So this would be a gatekeeper butterfly, for example. And then you get something else like a silver-studded blue butterfly that essentially is restricted to just one habitat. And you use these patterns that you see here to come up with an index of the degree to which something is a generalist. So this would be a generalist species or a specialist. And then what you can do with that information is you can take that information and then apply it back into the UK and then say for these different species, how much habitat is there available for it in order for it to expand its range. So across a wide range of different groups, so our well-recorded taxa, that's birds, mostly birds and butterflies, and also there's dragonflies in here and some other less recorded ones. What you have here is your pattern of range shift. So this is the same sort of data that I've showed you many times so far. Then here is the spectrum about whether or not there's generalists or specialists within that particular group, and then how much habitat is available for those species. And then what you do is you can then do these analyses and say, for the rate of range expansion, how much of that is to do with the amount of habitat that is available. And actually you find that habitat availability is explaining about a third of the variation that we see between our species. So right at the very start, I said we were surprised at how much variation there is across species. And now we know that about a third of that variation is simply to do with whether there's enough habitat for the species in the landscape. Interestingly, species traits don't seem to be as important. It's just the amount of habitat that's available. And actually, it's not either whether they're specialists or generalists that's important. It's whether, as a specialist or a generalist, how much of the habitat that you need is available. So you could be a specialist, but there could be quite a lot of habitat for you. And you could potentially be a generalist and not actually have that much habitat. And we also know that the habitat at the range margin is where that's absolutely crucial for shifting. So I'm not going to say any more now about those data, other than to say again, thank you ever so much. Please continue to send in those data. We wouldn't be able to do these sorts of analyses without the data sets that citizen science are sending in. They're just absolutely fantastic, and so that's brilliant. I just want to finish off with two things that we're doing at the moment. So again, we're back with speckled wood, but we're working on about 20 Lepidoptera species. And we're collaborating with geneticists. I'm not a geneticist, I'm an ecologist, so I like being out in the field. But we're collaborating with a geneticist, so with Ilix Akiri at Liverpool and John Bridle at Bristol, and also with Jeff Martin at the Natural History Museum. And about four years ago or so, there was a big push at the NHM to start digitising all their material. I'm sure you probably know all about this. And it was fantastic that one of the first sets of the collections that they did were the UK butterflies. So we started this project when we could just sit at our computers in York and just scroll through all of the data and know exactly what butterflies and moths were sitting in the drawers at the NHM. And that was such a fantastic thing to do, because what this project is doing is looking at the material that's held in the NHM from about 100 years ago. So we're using material from about the 1880s through to the 1920s. We know where the materials come from, they've all got locations, all that's been digitised, and then we've gone out and we've sampled from the same locations where those historical populations came from in the 1880s to 1920s. And what we can do then, through lots of really super duper next generation sequencing, looking at the whole of the genome, it's just amazing what you can do. Being allowed to take 2 legs from each individual butterfly in the NHM and extracting the DNA from that, we can then compare genomes over time. So what we wanted to know here was, after doing all of our analyses of range shifting, we now wanted to say, well, hang on a minute, has there actually been any evolutionary change over time? And again, I would say it was only in the UK that we could do this because the NHM had digitised all its collections. So once we knew what species and what locations we wanted to work in, we could just go down there and just walk up to the collections and know exactly which drawers all the material were in and how many individuals there were. So this is a project that's still ongoing, but just to give you a flavour of some of the results, what we do here, this is a measure of how much selection there's been over time. So this is called a Manhattan plot. Each of these is a chromosome, and we're mapping it onto the silkworm moth, which is the thing that's really, really well known. And those of you who know about genetics, these FST values for some of these are very high. So what this is telling us is that there has been a lot of selection over the last 100 years in these butterflies. We were quite surprised. So I suppose we shouldn't be surprised that evolution happens, but this is quite a large amount of selection that's been happening in our butterflies and our moths over the last 100 years. And so what we're doing is we're trying to annotate these genomes, mapping it onto what we know the functions of these genes are. I mean, there won't be a gene for climate change adaptation, but we know that there's a lot of other genes and what the characteristics are of the gene on the chromosomes, and that's what we're looking at the moment. And what we don't know, for instance, is maybe some of this evolutionary change is to do with pesticide responses, for example. It might not be anything to do with climate change, but that's what we're looking at the moment. So the bottom line from all of this is, evolution is happening, and there seems to be a lot of selection going on in our insects. And we know that because of the fantastic resources at the NHM. So we're so grateful to being able to use that information. And just finally, one of the things that people talk about a lot is about phenology shifts. So that's about frog spawn appearing early in the spring, whether the hawthorn is flowering, whether we're seeing swallows turn up earlier. So a lot of these signals of climate change have come about from phenology. So one of the things that people had been asking us about our butterflies was whether phenology played a part. And we know that butterflies are emerging earlier in the spring as the springs warm up. And we wanted to know whether that was a good thing or not, because there's been some concerns that things could get out of sync and that maybe emerging earlier in the spring could actually be a bad thing to do. So what we were doing here was analysing a lot of transect and light trap data. Sorry, I keep pressing the wrong... A lot of light trap and transect data to look at these phenology advances. So this is when do you see the first adults in spring. And what we wanted to know was, if we look at how much they've advanced in spring over the last 4 decades, what has happened to their abundance trends? So if the abundance trends have gone up, we would conclude that emerging earlier has been a benefit. And what we can see here is that if you're a multivoltine species, so if you're a species that's quite plastic in the number of generations it can pass through in a year, then emerging earlier here is associated with increasing abundance trends. So these are the winners. So some of these multivoltine species that are emerging earlier have got higher abundances, and that's what's being plotted on the y-axis. By contrast, these univoltine species, they can only go through 1 generation a year. If they emerge very early and there's lots of the rest of the year to go, they can't make the most of that and get through another generation. And what seems to be happening is actually emerging earlier is resulting in their abundances declining. And I guess that maybe they're more exposed to pests, they're more likely to get eaten. We don't really know what that might be, but there is absolutely no pattern. There's sort of Star Trek type thing. But anyway, there is no pattern. So here, my conclusion from this again is use multivoltine plastic species are showing a response. We don't think this is a genetic response. And they're benefiting because their abundances are increasing over time. So again, these are the winners. So I'm just going to finish off with a couple of slides of solutions. I hope I haven't depressed you too much, but what can we do to help? And I would say, yes, we can. So this is just a slide of some solutions that we've been thinking about and some of the examples. I won't, perhaps not surprising, there's a lot of this in the press at the moment about how we can restore habitats to make corridors and stepping stones for species. And we do a lot around this. And we know that, yes, you can improve landscapes for species and help them to respond and adapt by making corridors and better connectivity. There's a bit of a Goldilocks thing around this, though. There's only certain groups of species that benefit. Some species, like the comet, that are doing okay, don't benefit from improved connectivity. They're just doing fine as it is, arguably speckled would as well. And then there are other butterflies that you have to have almost continuous habitat for them to be able to expand. They're never going to be helped. But you have this sort of intermediate group that really benefit from connectivity. Bit controversial here, should we pick things up and move them around? Well, you can do, and we have done it with the marbled white. Whether we want as a society to do that and whether our conservation organisations would like us to do that is a separate issue, but we could do. So we can do these assisted colonisations. So we've moved marbled white up into County Durham. There was not possible, well, it wasn't going to get there for a very long time. We wanted to see whether we could move it. If you want to go and see, you can now go and see marbled whites in County Durham because we've moved them there, and they seem to be doing fine. So if you want to do this, and that's something that a lot of people have very strong views about, whether they think it's a good idea or not, but that's one of the options. And then the other one, of course, is about improving the amount of protected areas, these triple SIs that we have in the UK. And we know from a study of our silver-spotted skippers that their range expansion does benefit from being able to colonise protected areas. So protected areas do work from the perspective of helping species respond, but again, they do need to be better connected. So just to sum up then, coming back to this that I showed you right at the very start, there's a lot of variation in the responses of species to climate change, and a lot of that is because of the amount of habitat availability in the landscapes. And so there's this interaction, this sort of double whammy that people say, we're heating the climate and we're also removing the habitat. So for some species, habitat recreation is a good thing. And it will help species expand their range, but won't help everything. So it's not a sort of silver bullet, if you like. We know that species are disappearing from sites that are becoming unsuitable for them, and then the question then is there any way we can slow up those extinctions? Is there conservation management that we can slow that up, and it might buy us a bit of time and help those before they go extinct, and we might start to stabilise the climate? And then finally, we know that these evolutionary changes and plasticity are important, but they're probably not enough to help species evolve themselves out of trouble, if you like. So those are my take-home messages. I look forward to talking about them over a drink later, and thank you all for listening.